Hey guys, how are you? So, I'm back, and actually I'm back to start what is going to be a series of books that's going to run for the next few months, might even run for the end of the year. I'm not sure, it depends on how much I read. But I'm here to talk about, first, before we get to the books, we need to define a very important term. And that term is magical realism. Now, before we get any deeper than that, remember there is our shop where we have books and writing services. We've got a new book came out in May. We've got another new book coming out in July, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And to get first notice of that, join the newsletter. It's in the links below. There's also our Redbubble shop where there are over 100 designs, including this cool Monday t-shirt. Who else hasn't felt like Monday is being dragged off to prison going to work? So there's actually a whole series of these, one for every day of the week. They're really cool, and Her Infernal Majesty doesn't care about these. I can wear these all I like. So anyway, those are our things. Please like, subscribe, share, comment. Really helps these videos get out there. So I think that's a bit about all the housekeeping important stuff. So we're talking about magical realism. Why am I defining magical realism? Why am I taking an entire video to define magical realism? Don't we all know what magical realism is? No, we don't. Not when I'm seeing people call it a form of fantasy writing, where people are looking at magical realism as magic in a realist novel. And it's like, oh God. That would make Harry Potter magical realism. That is how insane that debasement of the term is. Gabriel Garcia Marquez would be rolling in his grave. Jose Luis Borges would be rolling in his grave. I've been practicing. I'm not good with Spanish names. Or Spanish extraction names. But rolling in their graves. No, we are not having the debasement of strong literary genres on my watch. No way. There is a reason why. There is a reason why I do not like this, because it takes something, especially something that has this really strong regional quality, and then just turns it into a nothing, which means that it then has no ability to communicate what it needs to communicate, which means you end up losing all meaning. That's a problem. It's a big problem. And people who go and read 100 Years of Solitude and call it the inspiration for Disney's Encanto, I think need to go back and read 100 Years of Solitude again. This is the kind of thing that, no, we will not stand for this. It is not a genre of fantasy. It is a literary genre. You don't win Nobel Prizes for being an expert in a genre of fantasy. I'm sorry, but you just don't. So, having said what it isn't, let's find out what it is. So, there are tons of names that are attached to the concept of magical realism. Some of whom are absolutely magical realists. Some of them, especially European writers who are actually better defined under other forms, and who I'm thinking particularly of Angela Carter, sometimes gets called magical realist because she herself had used the term in the late 60s, 70s, but ultimately walked back from that. I think as she, as a more mature writer, understood exactly what magical realism was. And in fact, someone like Angela Carter is a surrealist rather than a magical realist. And this is really, really important. Magical realism and surrealism are very, very close. They both developed at the same time in response to the same social, political, global upheavals. So they are two solutions to the same problems. But there are variations on magical realism. I think Laura talked about the fact that Richard Flanagan uses magical realist elements in Gould's Book of Fish, but that is somewhat, yes, it was trendy, but it's sort of alien in Australian writing. I have seen it attached to Alexis Wright, who is an Australian Indigenous author, but having read Alexis Wright, I would not say that is magical realism. I would say that she is an Australian Indigenous writer, and she is writing from that context. That's a really important distinction to make. Other genres that are, or other cultures that have adopted magical realist elements include many African writers. Salman Rushdie is probably the other most famous English-speaking writer who uses magical realist elements, though even there, it's not South American true, what I would call true magical realism, because something like Midnight's Children can be read as an allegory. The magic is an allegory for the budding democracy and the failure of the newly independent India to fully live to its potential. So there is that element to it. As we will discuss, the ability to read those stories in that way does change them from magical realist stories of South and Central American writers. So where does magical realism come from? Well, of all places, magical realism comes out of German expressionist art after the First World War. So I've got this. This is the book I've been using to tell me about the background of this, because it's not the easiest thing to understand. It's actually a really muddied concept. So magical realism was first, and I don't have my glasses on, but I cannot remember all these foreign names. There's just no way I'm going to be able to manage this, though I don't know how much I'm going to be able to see. So magical realism was referred to, first mentioned by the art critic Roh, R-O-H. I have no idea how else to say that. And he used the term in relation to in relation to artists like Otto Dix, Max Ernst, Alexander Candelor, George Grosz, and George Shrimpfiff, and their paintings, which they were doing after the First World War. He was referring to magical realism as an artistic movement that was distinct from surrealism. Why? Surrealism has a manifesto. A surrealist is sort of a closed shop to a degree, and it is driven by a manifesto that outlines, here are the ideas of surrealism. This is what we are aiming for. Magical realism, or magic realism as he referred to it, did not ever have any sort of unifying manifesto. It was a art movement that was coming out of the massive psychic shock of the First World War in the Weimar Republic, and it was fairly short-lived because we all know what happened to the Weimar Republic. We're not going to need to go into that here, but it is a very particular response of portraying, like surrealism does, the interior world of humanity onto the exterior, onto the canvas. So this is artwork with a degree of interiority. It's still realist because it's not fantasy the same way that, and as fantastical as surrealism looks, but it is also grappling with that interiority. Now, this then became a literary movement as it was picked up by an Italian publisher who actually was also a fascist, by Bontempelli. And he published a magazine that brought magical realist concepts to literature. Okay, so we have starting in Europe, in Germany and in Italy, this concept of magical realism developing an artistic wing and a literary wing. Now, this didn't really go anywhere in Europe. It sort of happened, and then, World War II happened. After the intermission, the war continued, and things moved artistically very far from that. But in South America, this was completely different. The person credited with defining magical realism, or as they called it, lo realismo marveloso, or marvelous realism, was Allegro Carpentier. So he was a French-Russian Cuban, and he saw this marvelous realism, what would become known as magical realism, as something that could fully encapsulate the South and Central American experience. So it is, from his perspective, and he is seen as the earliest discussion of this. Now, one other important name to include in this is this guy, Jorge Luis Borges. I have been practicing, who in the 1930s, and it's in this book, mentioned it, and then I was like, oh, I have that. I have a book of his nonfiction. I'm going to read that. He wrote a piece in 1930-ish, 1934, I think it is. But it is called Narrative Art and Magic. And aside from the difficulty of reading a piece where every example that he brings up, you have no idea what that book is. But it is because he uses a lot of books that are either culturally or specific and haven't been either translated into English or temporally specific and had more resonance at the time and have been lost 2 times since then. But he talks about narrative fiction requiring a certain narrative fiction being realist, but also requiring a level of magic to make it work, especially when talking about magical things, to be able to put a magical thing into a realist work and how that is done. So he talks quite a lot in that essay. If you want to read it, this book is The Total Library, the non-fiction from 1922 to 1986. So it's everything non-fiction that he wrote. So if you want to read it, that's where you find it. I'm sure if you don't want to buy it, I'm sure a library has it. It's Borges. I mean, he's famous, very, very famous. Intimidating, which is why I haven't got to him yet, but very famous. So he talks about magic, and he is seen also as one of the early progenitors of the concept of magical realism. It really depends. This is why this becomes such a nebulous and difficult subject to talk about, because it's not a manifesto subject like surrealism. It is really, really hard to tie it down to one particular name. So I have not read him yet. I can't tell you whether or not I would classify it as magical realist or something that is on the way to. I haven't read it. I will let you know once I've read some. But ultimately, he is someone who was traveling back and forward from Europe. He was incredibly important in his world, in the world of literature, but he had this huge influence. So he is setting a tone, which is partly, I think, why he's given credit as the progenitor of this, even though it has multiples. But to go back to Carpentier, he felt that what we now call magical realism would work best in a South American context because of the combination of the European colonial forces, the African slaves, and the indigenous beliefs. That the intersection of all 3 of these influences was going to require a particular form of writing to fully encapsulate and he references Cortes, what was unspeakable about the South American continent that he found, that Europeans found. I would also say that partly what makes magical realism, it's not just a case of, as Carpentier says, irrational indigenous and slave cultures meets rational Spanish culture. I would say that the Spanish culture that encountered the indigenous and African slave cultures was also bringing its own form of magical in miracle stories from the Catholic Church. This unquestioning of the miraculous that pervades in stories throughout the Catholic Church. So nobody bats an eyelid when a saint raises a child from the dead or cures an illness or some other sort of thing happens. These are seen as literal things that happen and are unremarkable because that person was in that position, which is a quality of magical realism. It's not just the exoticism of the slave and the indigenous cultures, I would say also that the miraculous qualities of the religion that the Spanish themselves brought plays into this. That's my theory. That's not backed up by the people who wrote that. I think that also plays into why magical realism was so accepted in the writing within South American cultures, South and Central American cultures. Regardless of your feelings about religion, I think that having, much like Joyce found it very difficult, regardless of his own feelings about the Catholic Church, to reject the extremely hierarchical, systematized way of thinking that the Catholic Church inculcates, that he then used for Ulysses. I think that it is impossible, even if you scoff at, to reject the narrative tradition of miraculous stories that permeate in the Catholic Church. So I think that has an element too at the acceptance of magical realism within South and Central America versus the playing with magical realist qualities in Europe, because he saw in Europe that magical realism was more playing with folklore. He did not see it in the same way because of that, because of the nature of indigenous, especially indigenous storytelling. But I think it also had to do with the particular strain of Christianity that had come via the Spanish. Okay, so because Spanish Catholicism is not the same as other people's. There are regional differences. I know they don't like to say that, but there are regional differences. So when does magical realism really find its big moment? Is in what's known as the boom. This big boom of South and Central American writing in the 1950s and 1960s. And the biggest writer out of that period is Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who is probably the first person that you encounter and go, what is this? Whoa. I've had 100 Years of Solitude on my bookcase for a very long time. It's taken me this long to get to the point where I probably ought to read that, but I need groundwork. Because these books now, where we are now, come with their reputations massively precede them. And I felt I needed before I read it to understand what literary form they were coming from. Because I know I read Love in the Time of Cholera. I didn't understand it. It didn't make sense to me. I need to reread that before I can work that one out. But Marquez is a huge name in magical realism. He's the one who brought this out. Magical realism has, and this is also where it differs from someone like Angela Carter, which is why she recanted her use of the term for her own writing. It has a social political edge. If it doesn't have a social political edge, it's not magical realism. It's just fantasy, and that's not magical realism. It has to have a social political edge to it. It is talking about something. Okay? And also the miraculous, magical things are unremarked. That is part of the commentary that it is making. Later, in the post-boom period, you get Isabel Allende and her writing. And you also get from Mexico, which will be the next book we do, Like Water from Chocolate by Laura Esquivel. That one I really like. And those ones, on top of the social political that they already had built in, brought women's concerns to the fore of these stories. They still are magical realists, but their focus is slightly different. Marquez is certainly not the you know, let's call it women-friendly writer. Yeah. He's certainly not a feminist writer, let's put it that way. So having other writers coming in, playing with this, using this from this culture, bringing a different voice up against this dominant male voice, which is not just pervading the literature, but also then pervading South and Central American society as well. So it is very, very much as I am using it, a South American term. Now, it has definitely moved into African writing, which, understandable. Similar sort of, in terms of being another post-colonial society, the African countries can see some way of using this as post-colonial writing. They make their own adaptations to it, but yes, that is a different form of magical realism. It's not the definition we are using here for the rest of this. I would say that really Europeans are not able to use magical realism. Why? Because of the way it is developed in South America, it does not then translate back to Europe or the English-speaking world. It is certainly not a blanket technique to apply across the board. It is certainly not a component of genre fiction. It is not a genre fiction component because genre fiction is not a social political document. Its primary use is entertainment. A fantasy novel is there to entertain. Sure, it might talk about some of these things, but you really start kicking up against the form at that point. You're like, let's sneak some politics, and then you'll get it wrong, so someone will complain, but it's like, oh, but I like this sort of stuff. I want to make this deeper. It's like, if you want to make it deeper, write literary fiction. Just, it's like people trying to make out those prequels of Star Wars are deep. No, they're not. They're not deep. They're just bad filmmaking with bad acting. As Ewan McGregor said, it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare being in one of those films. He'll never live that one down. Nor will George. But anyway. So, magical realism, moving forward, as we are using it, is magical realism within the South and Central American context, particularly of boom and post-boom writers. So, I really hope that clears it up for everybody what this is. This has been a really long and technical video, which I think I have it straight in my mind. I hope I've explained that well enough to everyone else. The next book we're going to do is actually probably the first magical realist book that I ever read, and certainly the most accessible magical realist book I have found, and that is Like Water for Chocolate. That has a really nice movie too. Before we move into some of the more heavyweight writers. So next time I see you, we'll be looking at Like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel. I think that's how you say her name. And until then, guys, peace and love. Peace and love. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.